In episode 105, we came across Dennis Noble, confidently claiming that neo-Darwinism is dead. I think most people with a modicum of common sense would agree with him. In episode 106, Noble expounded his alternative to neo-Darwinism, the third way of evolution, an esoteric theory with a strong Eastern mystical flavour, harnessing random processes within us and choosing to use them constructively. I think most people with a modicum of common sense would not be very convinced. Noble seems to base his confidence in a Lamarckian type of theory which allows epigenetic events to permanently change the genes in a genome. Nessa Carey is a specialist in epigenetics. She gave a lecture at the Royal Institution where she explained what epigenetics means.
You can't talk about epigenetics without talking about genetics, right? The human genome, our DNA, is composed of just 4 letters, but those 4 letters are used over and over again to create this extraordinary volume, which is us. And in fact, you inherit 3,000 million of those letters from your mother and 3,000 million from your father. So 3 billion letters from each parent, and sometimes it just takes one of those to be wrong, and you can have a devastating disease. So the genome sequence is really important, but it's not all that there is. And we've known that for a long time, because we've known of these things called epigenetic phenomena. And I'll explain that term in a moment, but let me give you some examples first. A maggot and a fly. A maggot and a fly look completely different to one another, and yet they have the same genetic code. They must have. There is no genome fairy that comes along and gives a maggot a new set of genes when it pupates into an adult fly. So in all these situations, we have scenarios where we have 2 things which are genetically indistinguishable, and yet those 2 things are different from each other. And these are known as epigenetic phenomena. Basically, 2 things are genetically identical, and yet in terms of their phenotype, how they look, they're different from one another. And the word epi is simply from the Greek, and it means at, on, in addition to, as well as. So it means there's something else operating as well as the genetic code.
She points out that the genetic code is a fiendishly complex arrangement of thousands of millions of nucleotides, and makes an admission which is rather surprising for an evolutionist.
So 3 billion letters from each parent, and sometimes it just takes one of those to be wrong, and you can have a devastating disease.
Evolutionists used to tell us about good mutations. The honest ones are now telling us mutations cause damage. Often serious damage. In the rest of the talk, she shows no doubt at all that in the beginning, those billions of letters got everything right all by themselves. But at least she doesn't claim it all came from the Brownian motion of our cells jiggling randomly in water, as Noble tells us. She explains that the DNA is wrapped around millions of little blocks of proteins. Processes in the cell can cause multiple switches on each of these blocks of protein to be set to various values. This affects the way the genes wrapped around the blocks are expressed. Genes can be switched off permanently. For example, in liver cells, all the genes for other cells like heart or brain cells are switched off in embryonic development and are never switched on again. But she tells us that the genes themselves are not actually altered and are passed on unchanged to the next generation.
All of these modifications are called epigenetic modifications because they're at, on, or in addition to the basic genetic code. And what they all do is they change the likelihood of gene expression, but they never change the sequence. The gene still codes for exactly the same thing.
But that brings up a phenomenon we came across in episode 62, when we looked at blue gum trees. What Lee Spetner called genetic switches, which appear to be reset, possibly by seeds in the germination process. This seems to be a problem for Professor Carey, because of experimental demonstration that certain behaviour in mice suggests that epigenetic switch settings can be passed on, just as Spetner pointed out years ago.
And they were able to show that that first generation had all the expected changes in their brain cells in terms of epigenetics and switching on particular genes, but so did the offspring. It's an extraordinary finding, and it's also completely heretical. Who's the chap with the amazing sideburns? Lamarck, exactly. Who's the other animal? Giraffe, yes, very good. So, as many of you no doubt know, Lamarck was a forerunner to Darwin. He came before Darwin, and he was trying to explain how you got different species and how you got different sort of inheritance. And the example he gave, amongst many, was that the long neck of the giraffe. And Lamarck's explanation was that certain giraffes would stretch to reach the highest leaves, and that would stretch their necks, and then they would pass on stretched necks to their offspring. So it's an example of they got a longer neck through stretching and they passed this on. It's an acquired characteristic. And of course, now we almost kind of laugh at Lamarck. You know, how ridiculous. That's not what happens. We know what happens. It's a Darwinian model. Some precursors to giraffes naturally had longer necks. That gave them a selective advantage. That got passed on to their offspring, the gene change that basically allowed them to have longer necks. But what I've been describing is the opposite of that. It's Lamarckian. It's something happens to the parent, they respond to it, which is an acquired characteristic, and they pass that on to their offspring. So there's huge amounts of basically fighting about this.
She seems to be caught between the discredited Lamarckian idea of inherited acquired characteristics, his famous giraffe evolution story, and the neo-Darwinian story of only genetic mutations causing change of inherited characteristics. And she gives the impression that Lamarckian evolution might be able to explain the giraffe's long neck, even though it's well known, and she knows very well that it can't. Richard Dawkins, pushing the neo-Darwinian narrative, claimed, "The giraffe's neck has the same complicated arrangement of parts as the okapi, and presumably as the giraffe's own short-necked ancestor. There is the same sequence of 7 vertebrae, each with its associated blood vessels, nerves, ligaments, and blocks of muscle. The difference is that each vertebra is a lot longer, and its associated parts are stretched or spaced out in proportion. But as Davis and Kenyon pointed out, Dawkins' characterization is one a Darwin disciple could love, but never an attentive engineer or any biologist with a working familiarity with giraffe physiology. As Lönig puts it, Dawkins simplifies the biological problems to a degree that is tolerable for evolutionary theory, but not realistic with regard to the biological facts. And this is not new. Gordon Rattray Taylor dealt with it in his book The Great Evolution Mystery. For blood to get to the giraffe's head, it has to have a heart that pumps unusually quickly and at a high pressure. To be able to drink, it has to have a unique pressure-reducing system to prevent its brains being swamped. The blood pressure is too high for blood capillaries to cope with. So it has a fluid under high pressure surrounding those capillaries, and giraffe skin has to be very strong and impermeable to cope with the pressure. Plenty of other unique changes are needed as well. Taylor points out, the giraffe's long neck necessitated not just one mutation, but many, and these perfectly coordinated. Like all other evolution stories, it needs more than a few random mutations. It needs major engineering redesign. Now that is so obvious that Salvo magazine, a general interest popular publication aimed at intelligent thinking people, noted, "We know of only one type of cause with the demonstrated ability to meet such a challenge, and it isn't dumb luck and natural selection. The engineering marvel that is the giraffe, long neck and all, was intelligently designed." We might ask, why can't evolutionists see that? Well, I think the answer could be that they're desperately looking for any other straw in the wind. Anything at all except the obvious involvement of a designer. And one of those straws is the genetic code itself. The Human Genome Project published its first findings on the entire genetic code a little over 20 years ago. We were told that only about 2%, later reduced to 1.5%, actually coded for anything. In saying that, they meant that they thought they could understand it. It was a blueprint for proteins. The remaining 98% was junk, left over from previous evolution, ancient disease remnants and such things. That just had to be true. After all, they couldn't understand it. But after a while, several universities got together on what is called the ENCODE project. They found that when the ribosomes receive code coming from the DNA, more junk sections are presented for processing than so-called genetic code. Many evolutionists, like Richard Dawkins, scoffed at the project. But several highly esteemed universities are working on it, and the New Scientist did an article on it in which they admit what non-biologists saw long ago. The so-called junk in the cell's operating program isn't junk. It's metadata. It tells the cell what to do with the protein coding sequences. Evolutionists didn't like facing that fact. It brings to mind the famous statement from Fred Hoyle before he was totally cancelled. The notion that not only the biopolymers, but also the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial soup here on the Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. It's so obviously utter nonsense, one might wonder how come so many of our super-intelligent scientists can't see it. But you may remember one of them, George Wald, told us why. "I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know to be scientifically impossible." One of the universities involved in the ENCODE project produced an article highlighting their contribution. They pointed out that during the ENCODE study, researchers found that more than 80% of the human genome sequence is linked to biological function. They mapped more than 4 million regulatory regions where proteins specifically interact with DNA with exquisite specificity. These findings represent a significant advance in understanding the precise and complex controls over the expression of genetic information within a cell. But there are desperate attempts to keep evolution in the picture. Quite a while ago, some regions of the junk DNA were seen to resemble virus remains. It was assumed they were remnants of ancient virus infections along with other junk, like pseudogenes left over from previous evolution. But then it was found that they, like the so-called pseudogenes, are not inactive junk. They influence what happens in the cell. They've been given the name endogenous retroviruses, meaning viruses that are an integral part of the cell. They've been investigated, but utter nonsense is being brought in. It's admitted that, in most cases, much work remains before a pathogenic mechanism is established. The biology of human ERVs must be better understood in order to understand their role in human disease. But in the very next paragraph, we are told the term endogenous retroviral sequence solely reflects the structural similarity between sequences of exogenous, infectious retroviruses, or XRVs, and ERVs. And although their very existence was only discovered about a decade ago, they tell us the persistence of ERVs in a lineage can stretch over several 100 million years. So the evolutionary history is fully understood by the evolutionists, while their actual biology needs to be better understood before biologists can understand what they actually do. But there's something about our genes that is true, very well established and very well understood. Random mutations are happening to the genome in every generation. Some of those mutations have no noticeable damaging effects. But as our epigenetic expert told us in her lecture,
so 3 billion letters from each parent, and sometimes it just takes one of those to be wrong, and you can have a devastating disease.
Just one mutation can be catastrophic. And the widely accepted estimate of 150 mutations in each generation is, as far as I know, for the 1.5% of the genome which was until recently considered the only part with any function. If the whole genome is considered, there would be many more. Even if there are only 150 mutations per generation, as generally seems to be accepted, it would mean that our genome can last no more than a few thousand years before total failure and our extinction. Disturbing effects are being observed ever more frequently. Failing digestive pathways seem to be affecting more and more people. Many cannot digest things like gluten, which used to be part of our daily bread. Some now seem to have lost so many digestive pathways that they can only eat meat. A rapidly growing number of people are unable to have children. There are even reports that Y chromosomes are losing function so rapidly that unless evolution can provide a replacement, world population will soon be in trouble. Many biologists have raised the question that with the accepted rate of mutations, we should have been extinct long ago, certainly in far less time than all those millions of years the ERV evolutionists tell us about so confidently. One might wonder, is it really wise to believe what those highly qualified scientists keep telling us? Or should we be listening to what Sabine Hossenfelder told us in episode 105?
But seriously, I've good reasons to mistrust science and scientists, and so do you. Physics today is pseudoscience. It's paper production with no scientific merit that teaches us nothing about nature. It's mathematical fiction. Pseudoscience pretends to be science, but isn't. Indeed, the pursuit of self-interests, mostly financial stability, is what's driving the problem in physics. It's baked into the current organization of the research system.
Nonsense is baked into the whole fabric of present-day establishment science. From its totally atheist worldview and its publish or perish paper production parody to its toxic funding procedures. Freedom from religion's celebrity, Sabine Hossenfelder, says she doesn't trust today's scientists, and neither should we. Let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.